Italian data science company. Having the opportunity of talking and discussing these kinds of subjects with Luca, in our case, was also always a source of inspiration, triggering many different reflections on the scope of cultural heritage. I think that he understands perfectly, and he has a very clear vision on the potential on cultural heritage in terms of the social impact that can have. So, Luca, thank you so much for being here today with us. I will give you the floor. So thank you again, and welcome to this WalkEUR project.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here today, and I feel a little bit weird to be a kind of head in a box, but I will try to explain a little bit which is my perspective. Well, as Victor has told, I have been working in the field of academic research, especially on the topics of religious heritage and interreligious dialogue with many foundations around Europe. And I've spent the last, I would say, 7 years working in the field of post-conflict cultural policies, especially in the Balkans and in Latin America. And in both this context, I've tried to work on the central role of language, and what I would define as a kind of semiotical transformation of sense of belonging, starting from the central role of cultural heritage as a driver for cultural and social transformation and social identity building. I've spent the last 3 years working in the field of artificial intelligence and automated systems for knowledge production, with the main purpose of trying to understand what would be and what will be the impact of automated decisions and systems for the conservation of memory and culture. And so I'm trying to understand somehow how the mathematical approach towards the content production and knowledge management is going to affect our traditional cultural approach towards cultural policies and cultural heritage. I had focused my previous topics on the relationship between social development and cultural strategies, but today I will talk somehow about frames. I will try to share with you a reflection, or to open some doubts on the way in which frames affect our way of reading the world, our way of life, and our way of remembering. When I talk about a way of life, I don't just mean simply our lifestyle, but in a wider sense, our way of living life, of experiencing reality, of doing things, saying, perceiving, living in every moment. When I talk about the way of remembering, I'm talking about the way in which we transform our experience into sequences of memories or sensations, the way how we select them, we transform them, and we decide which ones to preserve over the time. The first 3 themes I would like to focus on are therefore the following ones: the transition from the way of reading the world to a semiotical approach, the way of living life to identity building, and the way of remembering history to history making. I will share with you and mix somehow many different methodological approaches, but what I would like to leave you today is probably a series of big questions, of big doubts about our responsibility as cultural managers, as cultural project designers for the following years in the future to come. When we talk about cultural heritage, we cannot ignore these 3 levels of interpretation: semiotics, identity making, the role of knowledge making. I would define epistemology, and these 3 conceptual nucleus that profoundly influence our conception of what culture means, especially in the relationship between culture and society. Today, we'll try to focus in particular on how we create memory, is is profoundly changing, and how our way of making history and our way of defining the transmissible characteristics of culture and cultural heritage also inevitably change. But let's take it one step at a time. It doesn't matter what kind of sensitivity do you have or background, whether it is oriented to pure culture or to the cultural economy, whether to the tourism industry or historical research, or again, whether it is aimed at interacting with the public or simply at the virtualization of communication. Whatever your sensibility is, whatever your perspective, you must always be aware of one thing, which Marshall McLuhan has clearly defined over half a century ago. The medium is the message. What we say is profoundly influenced by how we say it. We must always ask ourselves about languages. We must question ourselves about languages. This is a topic that deserves to be studied in depth, both from an epistemological point of view and from a market strategy point of view. The way we use language, how we choose which language to use, we create interpretive filters in the way we translate the words and our experience. And then we create narrative filters, which again through language, again through the choice of words, modify the reality we are trying to describe. Language is important, grammar is important, lexical shapes are important. And today we are facing a kind of phenomenon at a global level where language is conceived as something secondary, as something not important, which can create confusion and lack of precision towards our conceptual framework. The grammatical warning does not limit us, but reminds us that we are in the language and gives us the opportunity to move within it. It reminds us that the language is ours and that it is not just ours, but it belongs to everybody communicating with us. It reminds us of our first conscious connection with others, which is the connection between those who want to interact and those who want to communicate. And finally, it reminds us that everybody could be a link, and that every bond with other people could become a link and open a new connection. Some writers, some intellectuals echo the idea that interest in grammar might be undemocratic or under-democratic, saying that it disdains the expressiveness and renewing creativity and force of individuals. They find it scandalously backward for someone to argue over a grammatical point, since so did the rulers of the 19th century. They believe that their attack on grammatical curiosity is full of progressivism and egalitarianism, that the rejection of grammar and lexical precision results in a vote for social justice. They do not realize that the interest in grammar and in lexical precision conveys the interest in the conservation of public space. Whoever looks at language and explores it and then decides if it violates its laws or bends them, looks at a fundamental space that belongs to everyone and that everyone has the right to inhabit, to know, and even to change. When I talk about cultural heritage, it is not possible to neglect this issue on the different levels of interpretation, on the central role of language, the issue of this conceptual nucleus that profoundly influence the concept of what we mean by culture. And we have to become aware that each linguistic choice is at the same time an epistemological decision and a narrative decision. From a certain point of view, we could consider language as the symbolic translation system par excellence. Today, in a historical era in which everyone talks about the datification of reality, the translation of reality in numbers, we must be aware of the fact that the translation of words, of the word into numbers, as we have seen, I don't know, in the movie Matrix, is nothing but the evolution of the same symbolic function of the language. Instead of translating the word into numbers, we can translate it into words. And in the same way, the translation can highlight contradictions, forcing and manipulation of concepts of reality. Probably all of you know that Umberto Eco was used to say that every translation is or could be a kind of a betrayal. Hence the first theme. The way we read reality is based on words, on the way words form concepts, on the way concepts are related to each other, and finally on the way in which these relationships make our interpretation unique in front of the uniqueness of reality. The second theme concerns the relationship between knowledge and identity, between the way we produce knowledge, organize knowledge, and define our way of being, our way of perceiving ourselves, our way of representing ourselves and transmitting ourselves. If before we spoke of semiotics, now we speak of epistemology, of the way knowledge is produced and organized, or even we could say the way we know knowledge. Normally, when we talk about cultural heritage or history in general, we are led to reduce everything to a series of data. That particular historical event happened on that date, in that place, with those people who had those names, and who were born on that particular day in that particular city. Or again, that that particular battle took place that day. It lasted a specific number of days. On the one side, there were a number of soldiers. On the other side, there were another number of soldiers. And normally we don't remember anything else, apart from sometimes the number of dead people. Or we remember the exotic characteristics of a specific story, I don't know, such as Hannibal and the use of elephants in battles. For how we are used to studying history, for how we expect it to be told, everything can be traced back to data. Let's try today to change scenario. Let's try to change context, and let's imagine something outside this conceptual box. Today here in Italy is a sunny day. At the beginning of December, there is crisp, cold air. It is one of those days when you should put on your coat, cover yourself up, and go for a walk in the city. And maybe while we are walking around the city, in the streets of the historical center, we see a sweater in a shop window. We enter the shop. Let's say we would be interested in that sweater we saw in the window. And here we try to recontextualize our approach to the history in this action of buying a sweater. The clerk in the shop takes the sweater, places on the deck, looks at us, and explains the thickness of the yarn, the chemical composition of the fabric, the elasticity index of that particular yarn, the color code according to the RGB numbering, the centimeters of the sleeves, the diameter of the neck and cuffs, the postcode of the factory where it has been produced, and the number of people working in that factory. Exactly like in the datification of history, we have all the specific data regarding the production of that sweater, and we probably couldn't have more precise information. The question is it enough? Is it that kind of information really important? Is this datification of knowledge sufficient or responsive to our social and cultural needs? Or rather that sweater interests us because, I don't know, that color reminds us of a sweater from when we were children, or the color of a scarf that our grandmother had handmade for us. Or maybe does that kind of sweater make us think it would be very comfortable on a day like this? Or I don't know, it could be perfect to go out to the cinema or for a comfortable evening drinking with friends. If you think about it, everything that somehow conditions or can influence our interest and will condition our choice depends on what I like to call soft information. Then there will be certainly some elements that can be datifiable in the strict sense, such as price and size, but in general, regarding to this sweater, everything that drives our thinking does not depend on precise, quantifiable data. Now, let's get out of this simulation bubble and come back to the key question. After a semiotic awareness, we have to face the challenge of an epistemological transition. We have to change our way of conceiving and telling the history of stories, or the stories of history. I will try to proceed by points. The first step, maybe the most complex, is that of the transformation from data to information potential. César Hidalgo, who was an MIT physicist who today heads the Center for Collective Learning in Toulouse, has tried to apply the theories of hyper-complex systems to the economy, and in particular to the knowledge economy. What I believe is important to do and to understand in the cultural field is to try to apply, and the need to try to apply, the same model to historical analysis, releasing the complex, multifaceted information potential that characterizes the uniqueness of every story, of every human history, and every macroscopic history as well. We need to start thinking in terms of gross internal knowledge. Each phenomenon, each event is characterized by an enormous amount of information, which we must be able to grasp, to understand, to connect, and to share. And so the first step is this transition from data to information potential. The second step is to get out of a linear logic of history. We must conceive the history of every phenomenon, every event, every person, and every object as a relational history. Each history is made up of many stories, and all these stories are in turn made up of other stories in a kind of fractal model, which allows from each microstory to derive an entire world. Let's try to imagine, I don't know, the history of a church. There is a big frame, an official history of the building within the institutional history of the area, of that specific land, that specific region. And then there is a history of architecture and ritual and ceremonial objects in the church. And then, if we zoom in, there is the history of that particular reliquary, which is the history on the one side of a popular congregation, of a specific devotional tradition, and on the other, for example, the history of an artist who lives on the other side of the world, and so on. We must not, of course, make all these histories and stories visible, but it is important to show how every site, every monument could be conceived actually as a crossroads. The first step, the transition from data to information potential. The second step, the transition from the linear logic of history to a relational conception. And the third step concerns the need to make history immersive somehow. In some way, the task of whoever tells a story or whoever tries to reconstruct it is to make visible the correlations between all the information axes, between all the stories that are interconnected. Whoever tells a story is both a translator and an enabler. While telling a story, whoever hears it, he can learn to see. In order to try to understand the complexity of this multi-layered approach, I want to try to give you some more operational information, contextualizing a couple of specific examples, that of intangible heritage and that of the sacred heritage, and the international institutional reflection. Cultural heritage is a complex system defined by the overlap between different semiotic levels, as we have seen. Over the decades, heritage studies have progressively questioned the one-dimensional approach to cultural heritage from both an interpretive and an operational point of view. And if on the one hand, it is not possible to consider heritage exclusively from the perspective of just one of its connotations, material, intangible, functional, symbolic. On the other, it is not legitimate to define a conservation strategy that is not holistic. In particular, when I talk about holistic management, I'm taking into consideration an integrated approach which is capable of simultaneously managing the social, economical, and environmental layers, which define the overall framework of cultural heritage. Cultural heritage represents a strategic resource in developing a human-centered approach to empowering local communities. The concept of enhancement of cultural heritage has undergone a deep change, must change, shifting attention from the objects to the ability of visitors to understand their tangible and intangible values, and from the ability of visitors to the opportunity to use cultural heritage as a driver for social change. Until a few decades ago, every heritage management strategy was focused simply on heritage itself and mainly on conservation, physical conservation. While today, an approach based on an active role of the visitor is increasingly being recognized. In this context, each person is considered as an active stakeholder who can contribute to the creation of cultural heritage meaning, thus becoming a kind of cultural presumer. Strategies for inclusion, for conceptual accessibility through storytelling, through processes and strategies for shared knowledge production can enable people to react to and to interact with cultural heritage, and can become a real driver for generating knowledge and cultural well-being. Now let's jump into the two examples. The first one regarding intangible cultural heritage. I will try to reframe it a little bit within international institutional reflection, and then we will move to the specific example of sacred or religious heritage. The progressive secularization of thought over the last 2 centuries has led in the past to a kind of desacralization of reality, and on the other side, to a rationalization of culture. And this applies also to the interpretation of cultural heritage. In a certain sense, the delegitimization of the ability to recognize the invisible dimension of reality has led to a reduction of the perceptive fields of our recognition regarding the manifestation of existence of the phenomena. The loss of the non-perceivable dimension of reality has led us to an impoverishment of the potential richness of cultural heritage in human landscapes. The rebirth of the theme of nature's spiritual value has been encouraging in the last few years the rediscovery of a lost interpretive perspective. Behind nature, behind the landscape, behind the visible reality, there could be an intangible and a dynamic dimension, which could help also to redefine the cultural and spiritual value of places. The UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage recognizes a double characterization to the invisible dimension of cultural heritage. On the one hand, it is a product which is defined as constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environments, their interaction with nature, and their history. On the other hand, it is a semantic and a semanticizing filter, which provides them with a sense of identity and continuity. In both meetings of the UNESCO Convention of 2003, intangible heritage is characterized and defined within a symbolic process. When we talk about intangible heritage, we must consider it in its manifold manifestations, which can be traced back technically to the phenomenology of symbolization, or let's say simply to the translation in symbols of the multi-layered nature of every single example of intangible heritage. In order to be able to understand it, to be able to communicate it and to preserve it effectively, it is necessary to have the correct interpretive key. From this perspective, heritage studies must necessarily take account of studies of semiotics, cultural anthropology, sociology, the social history of culture and art, in order to fully understand the needs and develop effective tools for a holistic approach in heritage conservation, as well as for a strategy for real accessibility and community participation. In particular, it is important to be aware of some criticalities. The first one, when we talk about intangible heritage, is multisensoriality. Intangible heritage, despite its name, is strongly characterized and can be strongly characterized by a multisensory approach, in which all the senses can contribute to the definition of possible manifestations and their complexity. The second criticality is its dynamic nature. Intangible heritage, as highlighted in the 2003 convention, is constantly recreated as a product of the interaction between the context and local communities. The impossibility of defining heritage in a permanent way obviously poses constraints, making it necessary to identify adaptable methodology and tools. And the third criticality, well, the first one, multisensoriality, the second one, dynamic nature, the third one is cultural complexity. Intangible heritage is the product of a process in constant evolution of the transformation of languages, technological change, demographic change, and pluralist contamination. Therefore, it is not possible to define a static conceptual reference system. Contextually, with the transformations of cultural systems, there is also a modification of the symbolic system of understanding. And so we get back to the two themes of the interconnection and overlapping between semiotics and epistemology, the way in which we perceive and translate, and the way in which we translate our perception into knowledge conceptions. Dealing with conservation of intangible heritage, making it accessible, means being able to adopt a dynamic, adaptable approach, which allows for constantly modifying methodologies and practical instruments, depending on the characteristics of each specific case. The heterogeneity of the categories included by UNESCO as intangible heritage also makes clear the need to approach the subject with multidisciplinary tools, which could be able to interact with a complex system. Now, I would like to zoom in and to jump into the example, the specific example of the relationship between sacralization and intangible heritage, with a special focus on the conception of sacred landscape. And let's say that the relationship between sacred landscapes and intangible heritage is an extremely rich case of study and reflection, but it is important in a broader sense to investigate the relationship between cultural landscapes and their uniqueness, which are largely defined by the framework of the intangible heritage that characterize the value of each territory. The Convention on the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society by the Council of Europe represents a watershed in European policies of integrated conservation of cultural heritage. The radical transformation from a heritage-centered approach to a human-centered approach regarding the relationship between community and heritage in cultural landscapes has determined a kind of revolution in methodologies, as well as in the definition of tools and models of conservation. The introduction of the concept of heritage community in the Faro Convention, which binds the cultural value of heritage to its living value for society, activates a process of community empowerment, sharing both the potential benefits and conservation responsibility. Cultural heritage becomes a system of values, not only from a point of view of intellectual symbolization, but also from the point of view of the everlasting history of social transformations. For the first time, a few years after the ICOMOS Charter on the Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage Sites, 2008, introduced the priority problem of finding the balance between correct comprehension and respect for the authenticity of the heritage value. In an era in which communication had acquired a too cumbersome role in the policies for the enhancement of cultural heritage, ICOMOS legitimately sought to restore order in a disordered scenario. As stated in the Charter, the need to facilitate understanding and appreciation must in any case guarantee respect for the authenticity of sites, thus posing problems of definition in the methodologies and operating standards. The same year, the International Council on Monuments and Sites launched the International Charter on Cultural Roots, which highlights the interrelated nature of the relationship between social history and heritage. In the awareness of the need for a conceptual redefinition of cultural roots management methodologies, the Charter proposes the characteristics that roots must possess to be considered as cultural roots. The identification of some elements must take into account, in the specific case of religious root, the strongly symbolic character of the process of definition and the sense of perception of a pilgrimage route. The preservation of the complex pilgrimage cultural systems must be based on participation, as evidenced by both the formal acts of the church and religious organizations and by international scientific and institutional reflections. The central role of the community in the integrated conservation of landscape is also confirmed by the Florence Declaration on the Heritage and Landscape as Human Values of 2014, which clearly remarks the key role of a community-based approach for the effective conservation and holistic sustainability for the management strategies of cultural sites. In the case of the conservation of a sacred site, of a sanctuary, of a synagogue, of a pilgrimage route, it is important to highlight that the community involved goes beyond the local religious community, but involves the whole society, basically for two reasons. The first one, the whole cultural landscapes are deeply modified by the presence of religious sites, not only that of direct religious interest. The second one is that the religious phenomenon represents a potential driver for local development from the point of view of economy, of social development, and of public education as well. With a view increasingly oriented towards participatory conservation, every methodology must base its vision in the need to ensure the possibility, diversified for each person, to contribute to the conservation and enhancement of heritage and landscape. Speaking of community-based approaches, generate the responsibility of being sure that the community could be composed by all its members, recognizing the potential value and uniqueness in knowledge production of every single person. There is therefore an institutional reflection that seeks to find a balance between the need to involve communities, to preserve an invisible heritage, to guarantee the protection and conservation for future generations of a necessary identity dimension. There is at the same time a cultural reflection, a wide cultural reflection, which must lead us to understand how the relationship between historical conception, historical reconstruction, identity sharing, and storytelling are part of the same conceptual and narrative system. A system based on correlations, on dynamic processes, on the ever-increasing fluidity of the permeability between the real, physical, and digital world. This is certainly not the context for addressing in detail a reflection on the cultural impact of the digitization of knowledge, communication, relationships, and work. However, I believe that it is important to reflect on one thing. Up to now, we have not found an effective way to create policies for active, holistic conservation of intangible heritage. Until now, all the experiences to create models for public humanities aimed at involving communities in the creation of a shared memory have often been intellectual operations. In many cases, I take the permission to say, totally sterile. Up to now, the problem of social education for a responsible memory has drastically failed in the face of the need to use historiography as a tool of soft power and historical acceptance as an element of social reassurance. In short, today the theme of memory and the interaction of memory with the confusion between reality and virtuality presents us with a new challenge, which brings with it all the challenges to which we have not been able to find solutions. Today, the only purpose of this short lesson was precisely to put problems on the table and open new questions. If we entrust the selection of last year's memorable moments on Facebook, if we entrust that selection to an algorithm which suggests us what to remember and what not, are we really, or can really consider ourselves as masters of our memory? If we entrust the selection of an information that deserves to circulate to an algorithm, are we really masters of our history? And again, if we are not yet figured out how to translate the gross internal knowledge, the information potential of every historical story and every example of cultural heritage into a true resource for social development, will we be able to handle the shockwave of acceleration of the production of digital information and knowledge? And finally, if the virtualization of experience and the digitalization of decision-making processes guide our everyday behavior, will we still be able in 20 or 30 years to really understand what the word culture means? Will we still be producers and interpreters of thoughts, or simple users of suggestions generated by recommendation engines? The challenge I pose to you today is this one. We know that the mechanisms of memory production, selection, management, and transmission are changing very rapidly, much faster than we could imagine. We know that today more than ever, the dimension of direct experience is experienced almost as a condition of vulnerability, and that we will increasingly run the risk of seeing a distance, both physical and conceptual, between reality and the way people live in it. What responsibility do the cultural managers and the managers of cultural sites, the planners of tourist routes, the promoters for cultural and education policies have today? I'm not able to leave you answers. I would not be able, but I leave you with by reading a poem by some passages from a poem by T.S. Eliot, who wrote this, which is called The Rock in 1934, which I think speaks clearly with respect to our slowness in our willing and capacity to face the changes we are experiencing. T.S. Eliot in 1934 wrote these questions. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? The cycles of heaven in 20 centuries bring us farther from God and nearer to the dust. Okay, when I read this, the poem for the first time, I was really astonished, and I felt a little bit stupid as a human being, but I wanted to finish my presentation, my simple reflection with this this quotation, this quote from T.S. Eliot, just to try to let you understand that we are waiting a long time before trying to really setting the basis for the opportunity to create real responses to the needs and the problems and the criticalities we are called to face, and we have been called to face and to deal with in the last probably 2 centuries. The challenge is open. Are we ready? Are you ready to unleash the potential of culture to ensure that human dignity, that the value of knowledge, the value of freedom, and the right to change can be respected? Are we ready to protect culture as a necessary driver? Are we ready again to change conceptual categories and language and to deal with the issue of cultural policies and cultural management, changing our semiotic and our epistemological approach? I think that the experience of the WalkEUR project can be founded, it should also be founded on this. Nevertheless, today, do we have to put ourselves in a position to work so that the memory of tomorrow can be the result of a conscious choice of cultural transition, so that the society of tomorrow can be the heir to a founding and fundamental heritage for the future, and not just a map for tourist destinations. The challenge is open. We all have to work together and to decide when and how do we want to be ready to face all the problems and the extremely challenging transformation we will be called to deal with in the future to come. Thank you.
Luca?
I'm here.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. As usual, your presentation is very mind-blowing because questions our very role in the work of cultural heritage. I think that also these processes of transformation that are happening right now, that you were able to conceptualize really clearly, open up the space for the challenge that you presented, but also I think for more questions that maybe can come from our side. So if you agree, Luca, we are all going to open some, like maybe 10 minutes of Q&A, maybe if anyone wants to share comments, address some the questions that Luca raised, or directly ask anything to Luca. This is the time. Yes.
Okay. If I can, it's just more a consideration than a question regarding the first part of this lecture, and it was about the language. And the first issue that came to my mind is that our cultural roots are made of many members, and of course the purpose is to have them around many different countries, and English is used basically as a vehicular language. So a few of us are English native speakers. In my case, I'm not a native speaker, and nor are the other members. So the challenge is really to use the language in such a way that what you say is how also determined by how you say it. So not lose the real meaning and message of our cultural root, but in such a way that everybody in the root understands it, and everybody outside of the root can get our message, so that we may convey it in such a way that it's really global, and using one language as a means of expression for everyone. So leaving it in a very practical aspect, that is a challenge that I recognize in that. And so the narration and interpretation, even if we work with consultants for the language, I have to take into consideration that maybe the consultant is for the language, but doesn't know the main topic of our cultural roots. So I must also be able to communicate to the language consultant what the topic of the cultural root is. So it's just very interesting, but that's a great challenge to work on.
So thank you. I couldn't hear your name. Now, now you were mute. Okay, now thank you. Yes, I think that normally we usually consider the translation simply from a lexical point of view, and so we pay for technical translations of I don't know, all the material describing our sites. But yes, there is this big topic that there is no separation, there is no distance between cultural heritage and the linguistic development in well, even to say in every country is too much, in every territory, in every small region. And I think that the interesting thing is that language is part of intangible heritage, that every word has its own history, and that it is probably the biggest part of European cultural richness. And I don't know if you have ever got in touch with the project of the so-called, I don't know, the title in French is Dictionnaire des intraduisibles, which is the dictionary of the words that cannot be translated. A huge project run by the National Research Center of Paris, led by Barbara Cassen, who has been, among the other things, a consultant of Nelson Mandela when he set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and she is an expert in Greek philology, and started to work on the concept of the etymology of the word pharmakon, which can have both a positive and a negative meaning. But her project tried to collect hundreds of concepts, of philosophical concepts that cannot be translated without losing a big part of its meaning. And so there are some words that cannot be really translated, and that are intraduisibles, that cannot be turned into something different. And I think that this could become a big part of our storytelling strategies. I don't know, for example, I got in touch with the Jewish Museum of Brussels a few years ago, because when I visited it for the first time, there was the description of, I don't know, which was probably I don't remember what was a short manuscript, a fragment of a manuscript from the scroll of Purim. And they didn't describe anything using the traditional name in Hebrew, and it was impossible to accede to the real meaning of the object. I wrote and asked them to describe and to explain a little bit more what it is Purim, and they simplified it when I went for the second time, the festival of Purim, and nothing more. So, okay, now we know that it is a festival, but help me to understand what is the story beyond the word and beyond this kind of festival, this kind of rituals. Use every single word that cannot be translated as the link of a kind of hypertext, a dimensional door. And it is a big challenge, but yes, we are moved to accept this universalization of English language in everywhere, which is, I think, a big weakness for our cultural strategies.
If you want to introduce yourself, so yes.
Hello, I'm Sara from Italy. I'm staff of the ATRIUM cultural route. My question, first of all, I really appreciated this presentation. I was very interested because I actually wrote my master's degree thesis on heritage interpretation and heritage preservation and creation. So I was kind of acquainted with all these definitions that are not really easy to understand at like first shot. So thank you. Do you think that the FARA Convention answered, even if just a little part, in a way, to the need of like cultural route to create heritage, to convey and preserve cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible? Do you think that's a tool, a useful tool for cultural roots, the FARA Convention?
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Actually, I think it could be a really powerful tool for mainly one reason, that for the first time it opens the issue of cultural heritage to a wider scenario of democracy and democratical responsibility. What I mean is that for the first time, community is involved not only as the user of heritage or the manager of heritage, but as part of its everlastingly process in transformation and yes, in its never-ending story of cultural and conceptual evolution. The big problem is that if we want to consider the FARA Convention as a tool for turning cultural heritage into something more democratic, is that if we want it to work effectively, we have to take charge of the theme of universal accessibility. I mean that if we want it to become really democratic, we have to turn cultural heritage sites or cultural sites in open spaces where everybody can accede and get in touch with. Otherwise, I think we take the risk of considering this process of community engagement and community-based cultural meaning building as a partial involvement process, which could represent the potential risk of misleading the cultural identity of local communities.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. An amazing lecture, first of all. Just to say thank you very much for that. Some of us are, I mean, the responsibilities are enormous, and when you're working in this field, it's a huge task, particularly for some of us who are working in very difficult parts of the world. That a lot of organisations and where the support is in order to sort of do the training and to educate the local communities isn't very forthcoming. So, for example, myself, I'm working in Belarus, and it's a country route. And I mean, I fully endorse everything. I mean, one of the reasons why we're doing this work is because of what the FARA Convention says, and in order to address the needs of the communities to develop more of a democratic language. But it's difficult and it's very overwhelming to hear what you're saying. I mean, I totally agree with everything you're saying, but the task is great, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on how that it can be addressed in places where we need to build democracy or create some form of dialogue and community building around cultural heritage. But these countries are difficult to work in and don't get the support that they need in order to do it. It's a vicious circle, and I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, I agree, and I'm aware of this structural criticalities. This is mainly the reason why I think that one of the missing bricks in the wider cultural strategies is the technical skills from the cultural sides in the activities of making advocacy and lobbying, because what I've experienced in the last few years, especially here in Europe, is that normally the politicians do not have the technical skills or the sensitivity or the experience to understand which could be the deep role of culture and social memory, and which could be the central role and the pivotal role of cultural heritage in creating communities. And they have totally lost the interconnection between the knowledge of the difficult dynamics of history and memory and social memory making, which could have a paramount importance for social transformation. And actually, I had prepared a totally different lecture for today, but yesterday night I was making some researches for other things, and I found an article by the New York Times published in July 1916, in the middle of the First World War. And there is this couple of sentences which say, "A new time must begin with new ideas and new emotions." It is the first page of the New York Times. "A new times must begin with new ideas and new emotions. The ultimate outcome of the World War will be just what we had hoped before the war: a strong alliance of America, Great Britain, and Germany." 1916. And so 20 years before the Nazi power and the Nazi clash around Europe, the first page on the New York Times was talking about the strong alliance between the United States and Germany, and everything disappeared because there was no cultural consciousness, there was no cultural diplomacy efficacy. And I think that today we are dealing with probably the strongest and the most dangerous cultural transformation. We are not understanding anything about the potential impacts on a short, medium, and long term. And we are called for the first time to face a radical epistemological transformation. Now I'm working with this AI company in Italy. We have a unit working in the field of education, and we go into the schools trying to let the students, the young people and the children understand that they are constantly influenced by automated decision systems, and they are not aware of this, and their parents are not aware of this. And every day I work with them, I understand how much important could be a new approach towards cultural education and historical education, because they are accepting as the normal condition for everyday life to live only in a single moment. There is no the conception of tradition. There is no the conception of long-term life project. There is no the conception of interconnection between all the different levels of existential opportunities and risks and problems. And they make their experience of life through a virtual frame, which is a smartphone, and they are losing totally the connection with the multisensory awareness of reality. And memory should play, I think, a central role in radically changing this kind of approach, because it can enable every single person to understand that there is not the instant existence, but that beyond every object, beyond every site, beyond every person, there is a story. and that is not that cannot be translated into data, because as you know, I made this example of the shop and the datification of clothes, but this is the direction we are living in today, and so it's a very big challenge. But I've discovered the central importance of cultural heritage working in post-conflict countries, and when I for the first time I discovered the deep importance that a single cultural site could play in the renaissance of a local community, I realized that in Europe we weren't doing anything for this, and we were turning every cultural site, every cultural policy simply into something close to tourism industry or to destination marketing, and even the UNESCO World Heritage Sites are considered as simply tourist destinations and nothing more. But I think that we should go back to the basics and the roots, and I don't know, read the constitution of UNESCO and the reason why it has been set up. And yes, I think that we have lost a little bit the meaning and the purpose that there could be beyond the cultural policies created in the second half of the 19th century. And if we go back to the 1916, we can read the first page of the New York Times, and Germany defined by the ally of the future by the United States in a very short time.
Thank you, Luca. Well, I think that we are going to start closing this session. Before that, let me thank you again for sharing your thoughts with you, for challenging us, and for inviting us to reflect on the scope of the work that we are doing, and also for this invitation to see with a very different approach and with a very different lens the potential of cultural heritage. Luca, that was inspiring as always. Thank you so much, and I just want for a small applause again.
No, thank you very much. So enjoy your workshop, and seguimos adelante.
Y seguimos adelante, Luca. Thank you, and hope to see you soon. I have the opportunity to meet all these colleagues from different cultural groups. It will be a very big pleasure for us, Luca.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Ciao, ciao, Luca. Gracias.
Ciao.